From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today's podcast is our annual year in review special, so we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. We'll be breaking the program up into segments and hearing from a number of scholars from across MEI to get their take on the year's major events. We'll be starting with an overview of the region in 2020 with MEI President Paul Salem. Paul, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Paul, 2020 has certainly been an eventful year, and there's plenty to discuss. I think it's fair to say the single biggest issue this year for both the Middle East and indeed the rest of the world has been the coronavirus pandemic. How has that played out in the Middle East, and what impact has it had?
Like other parts of the world, it has had a tremendous impact. The virus hit Iran and Turkey and some countries of the Gulf first. Took a while for other countries to be similarly impacted. But by the late summer, by the fall, when we are today, most countries in the region are facing quite a difficult second wave and a difficult winter going forward. It's hard to get exact numbers from all the countries. Some countries have very accurate counts, particularly in the Gulf and a few other places. In, I would say, the majority of countries, the numbers of infection as well as deaths are undercounted, either because there's not enough infrastructure to count or maybe they'd rather not count. But certainly it has been a phenomenon which has impacted every person in the Middle East and changed their life and changed sort of the feel of their life and how they go about it. In addition, of course, it's had massive economic and hence social impact as well. The Middle East is going through the biggest economic contraction of the past half century. On average, about 4 to 5% contraction if you take a regional average. Some of the oil exporters are more than that, about 6% contraction. And obviously the conflict zones like Yemen, parts of Syria, Libya are much worse off with contractions of about 13%. You also have a standalone or standout case, which is Lebanon, which contracted by about 25% for reasons not directly related to the pandemic. So a very, very painful year for citizens of the region. But I would say, obviously, this is ongoing. And a lot of focus from governments in the region is how to line up the import or production and distribution of vaccines in 2021. But I would also say that the overall impacts of the pandemic and its social and economic repercussions are likely not to be felt right away, but more in the year or two to come. And that really will be sort of the clash between rising numbers of unemployed, rising numbers of the poor. They were already high in many countries before the pandemic and the contraction. They've gotten higher and will get higher until the pandemic ebbs and the economies begin to recover. So that means there will be much more social frustration, social distress, but also the pandemic has dampened protests. People are not gathering in big numbers. It has also enabled governments to sort of assert more centralized control in order to manage the virus. So I think there's going to be a number of dynamics which might come home to roost in the second half of 2021 and beyond.
There's certainly plenty to watch on that front going forward. We've also seen some major geopolitical developments in the region this year, perhaps most notably the growing trend of Arab-Israeli normalization. How significant is that in your view, and what are the implications?
Yeah, I do think it's a very major shift. Obviously, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1978-79 was a big shift, but you'd have to put this series of normalizations, which includes the key Gulf countries, and I'm going to say it includes Saudi Arabia in the sense that it's Saudi Arabia's partners, very close partners, Bahrain and the UAE, who actually went ahead with normalization. So you'd have to assess correctly that Saudi Arabia is in the same path, along the same camp, even if itself doesn't seem to be ready to go forward. So you'd have to say Saudi Arabia and its partners have aligned in that way. And you have Morocco on the western side of the Arab world, one of the biggest countries of the Arab world, normalizing as well, in addition to Sudan. And you'd have to say that this is a historic sort of sea change, that with all of these major Arab countries now having normalized with Israel, that really puts the bulk of the Arab world, in a sense, in that camp. It leaves the Levant countries, mainly Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, outside of this sort of trend. But those countries are so mired in their own internal challenges and troubles. And it's really only Iran who remains sort of one of the strong regional players against Israel. Turkey talks a big game, but actually has normal relations, or at least has diplomatic and economic relations with Israel. So, yes, I do think it's significant. It is certainly and has been taken as such as bad news for the Palestinians. And they have expressed that they feel this is an abandonment of them and their cause. Normalization had been linked in the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 with the Palestinians getting what they needed, which is a state of their own within a two-state solution. These major Arab countries have abandoned that and moved ahead without anything for the Palestinians. So certainly for the Palestinians, it's a very distressing moment. I think the repercussions of this, one, in terms of Iran, I think that brings the Gulf countries and Israel obviously much closer together in counterbalancing, deterring, confronting Iran. Very much strengthens the U.S.'s hand in the region, having its various partners in the region, from Morocco to Israel to the Gulf countries, working together rather than being in conflict with each other. I think it will also have longer term economic, investment, technological, educational, possibly repercussions that that we'll see as time goes on. So yeah, I do think these are fairly important developments.
The end of the year also brings us closer to a major transition in Washington with the handover from the Trump administration to the Biden administration next month. We'll discuss the new administration in more detail in our 2021 preview episode in early January. But taking a look back at the Trump administration, how would you assess its U.S. Middle East policy on kind of a macro level? What worked? What didn't? What surprised you the most?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump took a bit of a bull in a china shop approach to foreign policy in general around the world. And it might be that as 2020 comes to an end, he might have more to show for this, one might say, out of the box policy, more to show in the Middle East than in some other countries. Certainly, the breakthrough agreements, and there's, supporters and opponents of these agreements in the Middle East. But you'd have to say that these are major breakthroughs, major achievements for the U.S. administration, for the Trump administration, to have so many countries normalize with America's key kind of ally in the region, which is Israel. And it's been welcomed by both Republican and Democratic Party leaders. So that, no matter how you slice it, will be seen as a major achievement of the Trump administration. And it happened pretty quickly in the last year. There wasn't much to show earlier. Prior to that, there was a trend of failure, particularly as relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that failure persists and maybe is deepened as the Palestinians really are no closer, perhaps further, than they were from what they need and what they deserve, which is a state of their own within a two-state solution, as I mentioned. On the Iran front, which has been Trump administration's one of its main pushes as well, I would say significant developments, but not the result that they or others would have wished. The maximum pressure campaign was supposed to, according to President Trump himself, bring Iran back to the table, create a new nuclear deal, and force Iran to negotiate on missiles and its regional interventions. None of that happened, but Iran has been weakened, strained, impoverished, if you will, by the maximum pressure campaign. And the U.S. did assassinate two top Iranian leaders, Qasem Soleimani and the head of the nuclear program just a couple of weeks ago. For hardliners in the U.S., that's seen as an achievement in weakening Iran's nuclear program and weakening its regional interventions. But I think it's up to the Biden administration to really negotiate or get to some positive outcome with Iran. That so far the U.S. and Iran are at loggerheads. Iran remains at war, proxy war with a whole bunch of players in the Middle East. That did not get any better during Trump's term.
Finally, as the year concludes, do you think you're more optimistic or more pessimistic about where things stand than you were when 2020 began? Are we any closer, for instance, to the resolution of any of the region's major conflicts?
I mean, I would pin a bit of optimism on two dynamics. First of all, 2021 should be the year when the pandemic ebbs and the economies and societies begin to rebuild and recover. That's a good thing. The sooner that moment arrives, the better for the people of the region. So hopefully, the 2021 will start very difficult, but hopefully the news will get better as the year progresses. Secondly, I am optimistic or hopeful about the incoming Biden administration that through foregrounding and using the tools of diplomacy, strong diplomacy, tough diplomacy, but really leading with diplomacy, I am hopeful that we should be able to make more progress in resolving and ending some of the civil wars in the region. Yemen desperately needs a negotiated and quick end to the civil war and a focus on its humanitarian needs very, very urgently. Libya needs an end to its civil war. Syria continues to be in very dire straits. A difficult case, but it does require some serious diplomacy with the Russians and others as well. And on Iran as well, simply having maximum pressure, forever doesn't bring us closer to resolution. I think the Biden administration can make progress, or at least can try to, with Iran. Iran has elections itself and has its own domestic politics. And I'll end with I'm hopeful that the Biden administration can revive Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, because no matter how many normalization agreements Israel has with Arab countries, the fact remains that the Palestinians and the Arabs in the Israel-Palestine space need the Palestinians there need a state, need their own political entity. There is no alternative to that. There is no one-state solution. And open-ended apartheid is not a recipe for the future.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you very much for joining the podcast, Paul.
Thank you, Alistair, and thanks for everybody who's listening.
Next up on the podcast is Bilal Saab, Senior Fellow and Founding Director of MEI's Defense and Security Program. Bilal, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Alistair, how are you?
Good, thanks. 2020 has been a pretty dramatic and eventful year when it comes to the Middle East. What, in your view, have been the key developments and trends in the defense space this year?
Okay, on top of my head, I'd say the rise or maybe the proliferation of unmanned systems in the region, which is causing us many problems, particularly in Yemen. In the past, our biggest nightmare was the IED, which ultimately led to our MRAP moment, meaning we came up with a solution, or I should say partial solution, to the IED by manufacturing what we call the mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles, or the MRAPs. Now we need another MRAP moment to address the growing threat of unmanned systems. And frankly, I don't know what it is. We're going to have to improvise. We're going to have to pursue some kind of a combined approach here, because there's no silver bullet. Keep in mind, our own defense industry in this country produces weapons for our armed services. I mean, that's logical, obviously. So the Arab partners who buy stuff from us, they have to buy what we produce for our own military. And we just don't have a legacy of producing shorter range air and missile defense systems for obvious reasons, right? We just don't need them here in the United States, because we face different threats that are more intercontinental, obviously. So I don't know where the Arab partners are going to find those systems. Maybe Israel. Maybe Israel can help the Arab partners, since it is quite experienced at shorter range air and missile defense, and it has the assets for it, whether it's Iron Dome or something else. And you know that the UAE and Bahrain have normalized with Israel, and maybe Saudi Arabia will too at some point. So, I mean, who knows? Maybe they can boost their defense cooperation in that space. So that's one key element, the rise of unmanned systems. And you saw that play out so clearly in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, right? So that's one. Two, you can't escape that one, the F-35 sale to the UAE, and that's huge. And I tell people it's not because of the nature of this fifth generation jet. It's because of what it underscores, what the sale underscores. And it underscores an increasing U.S. trust in the UAE as a military partner. We've had many sales over the past few decades that I would consider as groundbreaking. People forget that we sold to Saudis in the late, 70s under a Carter administration, F-15s. And the F-15 fighter jet at the time was actually the F-35 of its generation. There was nothing like it when it came out. It was incredibly powerful, versatile platform. In many ways, it still is to this day, right? And it's still used by the Saudis as the main aerial capability. And at the time, we sold it to the Saudis, despite the fact that the Arab-Israeli conflict was very much alive. Saudis had a very different attitude toward the Israelis, and there were some serious concerns about the qualitative military edge of the Israelis, which we now have codified in law, right? The F-35 transfer to the UAE, in many ways, is a recognition that the Middle East strategic landscape has dramatically shifted. We don't worry as much about maintaining Israel's QME, given the normalization deals, but we also recognize that for us to draw down militarily in the Middle East, we need our Arab partners to step up. And for them to do that, they need the capabilities, among other things, of course. And it's through this broader U.S. prism that the F-35 sale should be looked at, frankly. Let me add one final development, which I think is interesting. And for me, partly because it has gone a little bit under the radar and the media really hasn't focused that much on it, which is Saudi Arabia's own defense transformation plan. A lot of people confuse it with Vision 2030, the whole effort to diversify the economy, right, and move it away from almost exclusive dependence on the oil revenues. But these two things are very separate. The Defense Transformation Plan and Saudi Division 2030 are totally separate. And in fact, the Defense Transformation Plan precedes 2030 vision, and it even precedes the war effort in Yemen. So all the war did was reinforce the necessity of defense reform for the Saudi leadership. Now, I'm excited to see what it leads to because it is happening in full-fledged partnership with us. Behind closed doors, but it is in full-fledged partnership with us. What does that mean? For the first time in our history with the Saudis, we are actually helping them build militarily the right way. And by that, I mean by investing in some serious institutional capacity to support the military. Not just modernization, not just trucks and guns, not just hardware, but actually helping them set up the defense infrastructure to support and sustain all the military stuff. Let's just say that it's going to take more than a week, right? And they just started this 5,000-mile journey, and they're at the half-mile mark, right? But we have to remember that it took us, the United States, some 80-plus years to reform our national security bureaucracy, starting with the Dick Act in 1903, all the way up to Goldwater-Nichols 1986. And that's us, once again, post-industrial, entrepreneurial, free society, surrounded by oceans, not threatened by land powers. Saudis in a very different case, obviously. And I'm not saying they're going to need another 80-plus years, to reform their defense structure, but they have a long way to go. And this is going to require some serious societal changes, the kind of like what the Emiratis are doing, right, to their military and society under the leadership of MBZ. So these are the three main ones that I feel like are key developments this past year.
One of the other defining issues in the region this year has been the escalation in U.S. Iran tensions, starting at the very beginning of the year with the assassination of Quds Force head General Qasem Soleimani in early January. How did that dynamic play out over the course of the year, and what impact has it had on the region more broadly?
I think the assassination itself was completely unexpected. I was surprised. I mean, so were the Arab partners. Nobody in the Trump administration told them in advance that the U.S. military was going to take out Iran's viceroy in the Middle East, right? But it did. And for now, there hasn't been any major blowback, which brings me to an interesting point. Do we have more strategic flexibility to counter Iran's malign actors than we assumed? Because the assumption all along has always been that blowback would be so severe and it could lead to large-scale conflict that we shouldn't be even thinking about it. Well, we took out their top military commander and probably blessed the elimination of their top nuclear scientist, if we believe that the Israelis were behind that. And yet the response from Tehran has been more or less muted. So maybe such kinetic operations coupled with cyber warfare is a feasible alternative to significant direct military action that, say, would take out, I don't know, missile bases or nuclear infrastructure. Maybe the Iranians understand the escalation ladder better than many thought. And of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for more aggressive military action, but in as a policymaker, in that universe of options to counter Iran's nuclear weapons pursuit and destabilization efforts in the region, it just seems like we have a little bit more flexibility than we all assumed.
You touched on it earlier, but the string of normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states, including the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and now Morocco, was another major geopolitical development in 2020. We touched on it earlier with Paul, but I'm curious to get your take on things as well. What impact has that had on regional security dynamics?
So regional security, very little. Okay, so far at least. Everybody wants to portray this as the Arabs teaming up with Israel to counter the Iranians. I just don't think that's the rationale here. I don't think this is what really the leaderships in Abu Dhabi and Manama were thinking about. They're still as careful about causing conflict with the Iranians as ever. You just have to remember that the Israelis are also incredibly protective of their secrets and sovereignty. They didn't even want to sign a defense pact with us, the United States, their senior partner, because they wanted to maintain their strategic independence and operational flexibility. So I just don't see them anytime soon seriously developing defense ties with the Arab partners. Maybe some better intel sharing, maybe some joint exercises, maybe some joint ventures on military production, as I mentioned before. But I just don't expect to see joint military action like kinetic operations or even basing by the Israelis on Arab land, or the Emiratis are actually based in Israel. Yeah, I just don't see that happening, or anything of a significant nature in defense cooperation. By the way, it's not just the Israelis who jealously guard their sovereignty; the Arab partners too, and we know that from experience with them, and particularly the Emiratis. I mean, building trust just takes a long time. So what impact has that had on regional security so far? Very little.
Drawing down U.S. forces in the region from countries like Iraq and Afghanistan has been a focus for the administration this year. How has that affected regional security and our relations with our partners, especially in the Gulf?
It's a big question. So first of all, I got to tell you, a strategic review of our military posture in the region is long overdue, right? So maybe the Biden administration is going to conduct one and make it consistent with our top foreign policy priority of great power competition. Maybe it won't. I don't know. But that desire to draw down has been there for some time, and it didn't start with Trump. The question, of course, is how much do you want to downsize, and what are you trying to achieve with that footprint? I mean, those are the basic key questions, right? And if you asked me to do that review, I would base it on two pillars. So one, you want to deter against large-scale aggression, right? Because why? Because nobody does that mission better than us, because we're the most capable. And then two, you want to really focus on training and equipping our air partners, like in ways that we've really never done before, beyond, once again, the equipment releases and the hardware and the trucks and guns, and focus more on sustainment and effective employment of that equipment. And to fulfill those two goals, I don't think we need as many troops and assets as we have today. We can trim, but we got to do it transparently, and we got to do it responsibly in a way that clearly communicates our intentions to our Arab partners, and also reassures them that we're still committed to their security. It's just that we're going to be doing it now differently, and they have to understand that. And I would argue much better. I'm going to help you defend yourself and enable you to contribute to regional security, as opposed to what I was doing before, which is deploy with such awesome force that you don't have to worry about doing anything about your protection. I'm sorry, those days are over.
The end of the year also means we're in the final weeks of the Trump administration. Taking a look back, how would you assess U.S. defense policy in the Middle East under this administration? I know it's a big question, but in brief, what worked, what didn't, what surprised you the most?
Yeah, so much unpredictability in those past few years. Look, there were elements of continuity. I mean, let's not kid ourselves and argue that everything was disruptive with the Trump administration. That's not true. There's a lot of elements of continuity. And I'll mention to you also some that were disruptive and vastly unpredictable. So the CAT policy, the conventional arms transfer policy, it sounded like it was a departure from previous policies, but in reality, it wasn't. I mean, the president who started emphasizing economics and economic profit and buy American and all that over anything else was Bill Clinton. It wasn't Donald Trump. We codified that in language under the Clinton administration. All Trump did was just use aggressive rhetoric and be obnoxious about it, which made it easy, of course, for arms controllers and human rights advocates to criticize him. But substantively, really, there was nothing new about the arms transfer policy, which, as you very well know, is a big topic when it comes to the Middle East because there are such huge consumers and buyers of our equipment. What's new? Okay, the maximum pressure campaign, that's new against Iran. I think we knew all along that this was a long-term play. And it's hard for me to really evaluate and judge it because, Trump didn't win a second term. And I'm not going to say that it would have achieved its goals had he secured a second term. But with just one term, it's really hard to judge it. It certainly squeezed the Iranian economy, and now they have less cash to spend on malign activities in the region. It deprived them of some key personnel who, as I mentioned before, played key roles in their regional and nuclear plans. But did maximum pressure stop them from attacking Saudi Arabia's oil facilities, for example, like they had never done before? Or in engaging in various aggressive tactics against shipping at sea? No, it didn't. It didn't deter any of those things. So, I mean, you got to ask yourself a question. Strategically speaking, if you do a review, how successful was it? The honest answer is it depends on what you're measuring. I mean, what are your key metrics here? The Biden administration has to, I believe, build on those relative successes, whatever you want to define them. At least the economic aspect has worked, of course, at the expense of the Iranian people, because those sanctions have just had a broader effect beyond the regime. And then I would love it if the Biden administration would not do what almost every administration does, which is going to be virtually impossible, right? Because just not a single case where a new administration, an incoming administration hasn't done it, which is to completely scrap its predecessors' policies and start anew. The tendency is going to be, and the desire is going to be huge to just start all over and then go straight into nuclear negotiations and re-enter the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. But I would love it if they could just build off on some of those relative successes.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you so much for joining the podcast, Bilal.
You got it.
Next on the Year in Review podcast, we'll be speaking with Randa Slim about Iraq. Randa's a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Randa, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation, Alistair, and good to be with you.
Randa, I think it's fair to say that it's been a very difficult year for Iraq in 2020, from the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting economic fallout to the spillover from U.S. Iran tensions. What, in your view, have been the key developments and trends this year?
Yes, I mean, 2020 has been a very challenging year for Iraq, starting with the January 3 U.S. strike that led to the killing of Commander Qasem Soleimani of the Iranian Quds Force, along with Al-Muhandis, the deputy commander of the Iranian-linked Popular Mobilization Forces, which eventually led also to a retaliation from the Iranian side targeting an Iraqi military base housing U.S. soldier, leading to brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries for up to 100 U.S. soldiers that were based on the base. I mean, everybody was afraid at the time that we might see, basically war launched between Iran and the US on Iraqi territory. But I think everybody, all parties, stepped away from the brink. But then that meant that we had a cycle of tit-for-tat escalation from Iranian-linked Iraqi militias targeting U.S. assets, military diplomatic assets, convoys, that are servicing the international coalition forces working on Iraqi territory assisting Iraqi soldiers and Iraqi security services. And this has, this kind of attacks has come to a some type of a halt in the last 2 months, especially after Secretary of State Pompeo issued in September a threat to the Iraqi government that if they are not going to rein in these attacks by Iraqi militias, yet militias that are linked and funded and trained by Iran, that the U.S. will withdraw its diplomatic presence in Iraq and close its embassy. I think that has led also not only Iraqis but also Iranians who were trying as much as possible to create developments on the ground through their Iraqi proxies that might escalate tensions with the US. And especially as the US enters its election cycle, there were hope at the time that there will be a change in the US administration, which is now going to happen come January 20. And Iran and Iranian officials were starting to look maybe for a possibility of thawing of some of these tensions with the US, along with maybe the Biden administration eventually as part of this compliance, both sides rejoining the JCPOA, that sanctions will be lifted, which is extremely important for an Iranian economy that is really, in major challenge territory, if we can put it this way. So we have had that, and that colored pretty much, that event on January 3 and the escalation that followed, colored pretty much security political dynamics in the country. Add to that, COVID, the crumbling oil prices. After all, more than 90% of Iraq revenues are from oil. And on top of that, Iraq is a net importer of almost everything it needs, except for oil. And so the combination of COVID, which really hit Iraq hard, especially given the fragility of the health sector system in Iraq, and the tumbling oil prices, which now make Baghdad deal with a monthly deficit anywhere from 3.5 to 4.5 billion dollars a year just to meet public sector salaries and basic commodities, and overhead. And so they are now stuck in a major financial crisis, which will get exacerbated, I think, starting in January. Already the prime minister of Iraq has warned that they might not be able to pay public, sector salaries come January. And that economic crisis in Iraq always means, or can always translate quickly into a security crisis. And that will create early challenges for the Biden administration come January. Add to that, you had new government formed in Iraq after a couple of attempts, before Mr. Qademi, the former head of Iraqi National Security Service, was agreed upon by the different political parties and leaders in Iraq as being the prime minister. He came in with a lot of hope. He made a number of promises in dealing with the host of challenges that Iraq at the time is and now still dealing with, from security to political to economy. And yet, 7 months into his tenure, he has yet to act on many of these promises, and especially in the economic front. The Iraqi finance minister, Dr. Alawi, is a very savvy technocrat, very savvy economist. His ministry presented a white paper for economic reform on October 13. And yet we have seen political parties, we have seen business interests affiliated with these political parties basically block any movement toward necessary economic and fiscal reforms. Right now, the economic file is really an existential file for Iraq. Economic reforms are urgent and of an existential nature. And yet, we have not seen the kind of leadership from the prime ministership office, nor from other leaders of Iraq, be it the president or the speaker of the parliament, and also definitely not from the major political parties that really are the decision makers in Iraq to move quickly and seriously on the file of economic reforms.
You covered a lot of ground there, but one of the other major issues that you didn't touch on is the sort of on again, off again, hot and cold nature of relations between Baghdad and Erbil. How has that kind of evolved over the course of 2020?
Well, it is hot again now. I mean, we have recently seen protests in Sulaymaniyah because, people for the most part of 2020 have not been paid, especially people, public sector employees have not been paid their salaries. And you have right now a delegation headed by the deputy prime minister of the KRG in Baghdad trying to negotiate with Baghdad measures that will satisfy demands by Baghdad for the KRG to submit its oil revenues and non-oil revenues to Baghdad in return for getting its share of the federal budget. Look, this relationship has been going, as you said, through ups and downs. But in my opinion, I mean, increasingly as these conflicts keep repeating, as these disputes keep repeating, we have short-term fixes, then we are back to the old problems. It looks like institutionally, with the passage of time, there is less and less capacities and resilience to be able to deal, to be able to prevent these ongoing disputes from continuously erupting, and for coming up with sustained kind of solution and understanding to deal with these issues. Look, these have been long-standing disputes between the KRG and Baghdad. So it's not only about KRG share of the federal budget and KRG paying or transferring its oil revenues. It's also about border regulation. It's also about the relationships between the Peshmerga on one hand and the Iraqi security services, especially federal services. Add to the mix now, you have a lot of these PMF that also operate, in territories where you have Peshmerga and where you have also federal services or, Iraqi security services. What we are seeing is more issues getting thrown into this conflict system between the KRG and Baghdad rather than less issues. So making this conflict system more complicated, more protracted, and add to that diminished capacities by officials in both Baghdad and Erbil to deal with this conflict system, both in a preventative fashion, but also in a conflict management fashion.
Randa, we've discussed a number of different challenges facing Iraq, but as the year comes to a close, is there anything that gives you cause for optimism?
Look, I think there is one development that I don't think is being paid enough attention, which is the split that has started and is taking place inside the ranks of the popular mobilization forces. Look, I think these militias are the number one challenge. I would say the economy maybe is number one challenge. They are if not number one, it is easy number two challenge to the future security and stability of Iraq. And we have now recently seen a split between the Iran-linked militias of the PMF and then the four main groups of the PMF that are linked to the Marja'iyya, to Najaf and to Karbala. And the four, that are linked to Marja'iyya command about 20,000 fighters. So the split between them, which has been now ongoing for some time and came more and more to the fore recently in this conference that the Marja'iyya-linked PMF groups held, is over, a number of issues. One is resources and allocation of, military equipment and money that usually the federal government puts into the mix for the PMF, with the Marja'iyya-linked militia saying that the Iran-linked militias are monopolizing those resources and not giving them their fair share. Second, most importantly, is also ideological division, which is basically, the belief of the Iran-linked, PMF, of their loyalty and relationship to Tehran and allegiance to Tehran, versus the Marja'iyya-linked militias look at themselves as Iraqi first, And then third is over their role in politics, with the Iran-linked PMF contesting the political space in the past and, forming this Fatah, along with others, this Fatah coalition, which has the second highest number of parliamentarians in the current Council of Representatives in Baghdad, but versus the Marja'iyya-linked PMF saying, okay, you can vote, you can, but you don't contest the political space. You don't contest less parliamentary seats. And so this kind of split that's taking place inside the PMF is interesting to watch, and what the Marja'iyya-linked PMF want to do is to totally move away from the PMF, have their own, in a way, status, answering directly to the Prime Minister office and bypassing the PMF organization, the PMF leadership and administration. And so as this, evolves, it's going to be interesting to watch what kind of a space these Marja'iyya-linked PMF can command and what kind of influence they can have in terms of the other PMF and in terms of reining in and maybe changing public opinion vis-a-vis the Iran-linked PMF.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Randa, thank you again for joining the podcast today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Next up, I'm delighted to welcome Marvin Weinbaum to discuss Afghanistan. Marvin is the director of MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program. Marvin, thank you for joining us today, and welcome back to the podcast.
My pleasure.
Marvin, from the U.S. Taliban agreement at the end of February to the start of intra-Afghan talks, 2020 has been a year of real ups and downs. As a longtime Afghanistan watcher, what have been your main takeaways?
Well, Afghanistan has been up and down in many respects, but I think this year was particularly difficult for raising hopes, creating, I think, high expectations, and a lot of downers as well. The takeaway I think I have from this is expect the unexpected, because you won't be disappointed. It's something that I think we have to keep an open mind on what's going to happen going forward here and be prepared for a number of eventualities.
The coronavirus pandemic has affected countries around the world, rich and poor alike, and Afghanistan is certainly no exception. How have things played out in the country, and what has been the response effort like over the course of the year?
Initially, I think there was great apprehension that the virus was going to have a devastating impact on the country. As we talk today, I would say certainly Afghanistan has not gotten off easily, but on the other hand, the worst has not happened. Given the fact that the country has a health infrastructure which is, to put it mildly, inadequate, and I say that because testing, lab evaluation, reporting, and all of that, not to mention hospital facilities and equipment and qualified doctors, all of that is in short supply. The figures as they appear now seem to indicate that the country thus far has managed to get by. Maybe we have to put things in perspective. After all, it's got so many other problems. A war going on, an economy which is just struggling, and also a great concern here for the future. So it has to fight for people's attention that there is here a pandemic in the country. The actual numbers, again, are seem reasonable. It certainly seems to have fared better than neighboring Pakistan and Iran. But again, maybe we're missing a great deal here. And if we had better information, we would discover that it has had a far more devastating impact. And we're not through this, certainly. We will just have to watch this carefully. But so far, again, we're not in where we thought we would be at this point, where we would have a nationwide crisis on our hands that consumed everything else.
Marvin, one of the year's major developments has, of course, been the launch of the intra-Afghan talks. Where do the talks stand? And at this point, how optimistic are you that a deal can ultimately be reached?
Well, we saw what was to be with the American Taliban agreement at the end of February was to be an immediate move toward serious negotiations. They were expected to start, I think, 10 days' time. They did finally sit down early in September. So obviously, great disappointment there. And they debated throughout those months, those 6 months or so, just the preliminaries to actual talks. They could not agree on procedures on how this should take place. And then there were some items left over from the agreement, which the Taliban claimed were not being honored, and they would not go ahead until that time when those were met. And chief among those was a prisoner release. The Kabul government had not been a party to the agreement, the bilateral agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban. Indeed, the government had been excluded. And so here they were being told, you are going to have to release 5,000 prisoners, and the Taliban would decide which ones they wanted. Well, it just so happens, of course, that among those were prisoners who were, by any definition, dangerous terrorists. But they had to lump it. Ultimately, they had to give way, and they did so only incrementally, till they met the Taliban's demands. And they might have held out even longer, but the United States, so anxious to keep the agreement of February from falling apart, and therefore not having the justification for leaving at the end of April, by the end of April, the U.S. put enormous pressure on the government effectively to cave in to just about on that issue and on other issues. Well, early in September, as I say, they did sit down with great fanfare. They sat around. This was to be the beginning of the end of this conflict in a lot of people's mind. All they had to do was to simply do a little compromising, hammering out something. But as I mentioned already, procedural aspects of this, they got through. There were 22 of them. They got through 20. They could not agree on the last two. And for that reason, it then went on 2.5, 3 months longer till they finally got to the point that they finessed some of the issues. Again, the government gave in on some. And therefore, we then anticipated that we would now see getting down to the real nitty-gritty of finding a peace. And that is deciding what kind of government there would be going forward and what would be the character of the state. Would it be the state that the Taliban would seem to want, and that is essentially what they call a pure Islamic state, or would it be some version of the current constitutional government, which provides for elections and representatives in a parliament and other mechanisms which reflect popular will? And the Taliban made it very clear that it would not be popular will that would be the guide for the future. It would be the Quran or the Sharia, which is the legal framework. So we find ourselves having to be disappointed, obviously, because now some 10 months have gone by. They should have been really down to determining whether it would be possible to have a power sharing arrangement. But we have learned something in the process. And in that sense, maybe it took too long and it should have been evident much earlier. And that is that this is going to be an extraordinarily difficult future for the talks throughout this period of time since the February agreement. The Taliban essentially have not given way on any substantive issue. As I suggested, it's been the government, or they found some way to finesse the issue, kicking it down the road. But if we realize that fact, it's going to be very hard to see how they can reach some kind of reconciliation. So, as I see it, the prospects for the future, based on what we've already seen this year, can't be very promising.
Marvin, I wanted to turn next to the security situation. Even though peace talks are underway, Afghanistan has seen no let-up in violence. If anything, the opposite seems to be true. What's driving that trend, and what impact is it having on the talks?
Well, I really didn't mention that among the things that the Taliban did not deliver on, and they were supposed to make a pledge that they would break their ties with groups like Al-Qaeda. Well, the best intelligence that we and the UN and everybody else has is that they haven't done that. It's a long-standing relationship, and maybe we were naive to believe that they were going to simply cut off what had been for them a lifeline in some ways, going back more than 20 years, 25 years. So they did not follow through on that. And there also was an understanding that violence were going to drop off considerably. They refused to have a ceasefire, but at least we thought that we could count on a reduction of violence as a way of helping to propel the talks forward. But as you've pointed out, instead, what we have seen, and increasingly so, is that violence is there in a very, very large way, and that it once again questions the good faith of the Taliban, that they really are sincere about wanting some kind of power sharing. What I have been arguing is what they want is inclusive government. They use that term frequently, that they want an inclusive government. But as they see that doesn't mean that we'll trade off this against this, and you can have that, and we'll have this. What they mean is that it'll be inclusive in that you're all invited to join an emirate, an Islamic emirate. We will make place for you in Islamic emirate. But they're saying is that this kind of peace will be on our terms.
Before we wrap up, Marvin, we've discussed a number of problems and challenges facing Afghanistan, but I'm curious, as the year comes to a close, is there anything that gives you cause for optimism looking forward?
Well, it's the Afghan people themselves that give me cause for optimism. There is in the country a large group, we're talking about several million people who are educated and have made an enormous investment in the future of this country and have shown such resilience. And I include also, in a different category, a military which has been under tremendous pressure but has not folded. So I really put my faith here that they'll hang in there. And if it means that we have to go into the year and find out that an agreement with the Taliban is not possible, that they won't quit on Afghanistan, but that they'll put their noses to the grind, that the government will rise to the occasion, the political class will, and they'll say, look, we're going to have to make this work. We're not going to get out of it through a conciliatory agreement with the Taliban, but we can survive, we can thrive. We're going to need international support to do that. But we're not giving up on this country where so much has been accomplished in the last 20 years to go along with things that, have not gone well. Flaws everywhere, certainly in the political system. That's really what I put my faith on. The alternative here, if that doesn't work, is that we're going to see millions of refugees. And that's going to be a humanitarian crisis that the U.S. and everybody else is going to be impacted by, because we're talking about, I would estimate, about 10 million people fleeing the country if the Taliban were to emerge dominant. It might be after a bloody civil war in which something far more chaotic than anything we have seen to date.
On that somber note, we'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you.
I tried to make it optimistic. I'm sorry.
You came back to grim in the end. It's all right. No worries. Thank you for joining us today, Marvin.
My pleasure.
That's our program for today, but I'd like to thank all of our guests from across MEI, and thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on the program. We'll be off for the next few weeks and then back in early January. Happy holidays.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.